Greetings. Hegel on the beach, Hegel and the French Terror. This is a two-parter. Part one today. Today we're asking, what was the French Terror? What was Hegel's view of phenomenology? Was the terror of the French Revolution inevitable? Was it justified? By justified, I mean, was there another way to get rid of the absolute monarchy of Louis XVI and for the new republic to fight its external enemies who were intent on destroying it? Okay, so could another less violent and terroristic path have been taken? And if that peaceful path was blocked, then why was it blocked? Okay, so if phenomenology is about the development of spirit, social consciousness over time, does Hegel see the terror as a necessary development in social consciousness? And if he does, doesn't that mean we can justify any terroristic action? And the short answer, we know that Hegel celebrated the French Revolution on its anniversary. And the punchline is, I think for Hegel, the terror wasn't necessary, if a tragic and horrible step in the education of the social mind. Big word, Bildung, he uses. But he was still repelled by it, the terror. And this is not a straightforward justification, nor is it a condemnation of the terror. Hegel describes how the mind or the spirit or social psychology of French society played out. So it's not an ex post facto, kind of after the fact justification. Hegel's projects to show how social consciousness moves historically. So one of spirit's moves is for the self to try to become all of reality. So for example, in the confrontation of the master and slave, the master wants to be all reality, or the two people want to be all reality, and one of them wins. So the self, or the will, famously expressed in Hegel's account, wants to be answerable to itself only. So the self is reason, the reason of, say, Descartes, keep on talking about him, and the Enlightenment, that demands autonomy. So when the monarchy is deposed, absolute freedom, this phrase we'll come back to, or reason, that's placed on the throne of France, almost literally. So reason is the truth and the power to make the truth, the unfettered power to do so. So paragraph 584 says, this brings onto the scene spirit in the form of absolute freedom. It is conscious of its pure personality, and with that of all spiritual reality. And all reality is solely spiritual. The world is for it absolutely its own, and this will is universal will. 590 describes the terror like this. Okay, so the sole work and deed of universal freedom is therefore death. For what is negated is the empty point of the absolutely free self. It is thus the coldest and meanest of all deaths, with no more significance than the cutting off a head of cabbage or drinking a mouthful of water. So what is this absolute freedom of the French Revolution? So the sole purpose of absolute freedom is death. I mean, sounds a bit pretentious, doesn't it? So let me explain what absolute freedom means in more detail. So for Hegel, this moment of absolute freedom didn't begin with the Revolution, 1789, or the storm of the Bastille, or the dictatorship of Robespierre. No, the concept of reason as absolute freedom, that was created by the Enlightenment and was finally in general, and that was finally realized in spectacular fashion during the Revolution, when the revolutionaries decided that nothing would stand in the way of reason, absolute freedom. So humanity makes its rules. It won't be bound by tradition. And that meant confronting the power of history, the power of tradition, power of superstition. So absolute freedom meant the use of the educated mind alone to determine the truth. Tradition, on the other hand, meant subjecting yourself to the dictatorship of ignorance. France, therefore, would be rebuilt from scratch by human intelligence. New legal system was instituted, weights and measures system, kilogram, decimalization, which the world still uses today. So every aspect of life was put under the microscope of reason. So these transformations were inspirational for people across Europe, and probably still are in many cases. But for the poet Wordsworth, to basically all good-thinking, progressive people, they loved it initially. Okay, so let's rid ourselves, was the view, of this ignorance yesterday by re-examining everything. Ruthless critique of everything that exists. That's Marx later on used that phrase. Yeah, made it famous. But and let's start again. But the French Revolution, let's start again at year zero. Or year one, as the French Revolutionists called it. So absolute freedom meant that we had to reevaluate even time itself. For example, the revolutionaries renamed, you probably heard this one, the days of the week, months of the year. They went as far, though, you might not have heard this, as dividing the day into 10 hours, each hour into 100 decimal minutes, each decimal minute into 100 decimal seconds. An hour was there for 144 conventional minutes. I mean, that's a big change, isn't it? It's a revolutionary change. The revolutionaries basically restarted the clock of history by saying that 1792 was year one. And almost 200 years later, another group of revolutionaries, this time in Cambodia, the Khmer Rouge, educated in France, or at least most of them were heavily influenced by France. Cambodia was a French colony. They were also probably French Communist Party members. They also thought that they would start again at year zero. They were inspired by the French Revolution and the Russian Revolution, of course. And we know that the Khmer Rouge took terror to a new level. So the revolution maintained that belief in God should be based on reason rather than revelation or scripture. Not the Cambodia, this is the French Revolution. Okay. So deism's proposition was that there is a God, but he's a very distant one. Yeah. The deist God created the laws of nature, which were accessible to the human mind via reason. Okay, so that's another context of the French Revolution. Robespierre himself promoted the religious cult of the deist God called the Supreme Being. An estimated 400,000 people assembled, to what us in the 21st century must look like comedy almost, to lead a ceremony. Robespierre led a ceremony, I should say, to honour the cult of the Supreme Being. Reason, singing hymns of praise and so on. So that took place where the Eiffel Tower stands today. And the French artist David painted a picture of the scene. So he designed, by the way, the entire event. It was built he even built a hill in the middle of the Paris to showcase this ritual. So absolute freedom and enlightenment, enlightenment idealism, that developed alongside, as I said in the last video, a desire for authenticity in religion. And it turned, there was atheism, but essentially it was turned from the orthodoxy of Catholicism, with its pictures and icons and statues and sacred relics and bones of saints and so on, and move away from this towards personal faith. Inner religion, I'd call it, something like an inner faith. Okay. As I described in the last video, the Enlightenment encouraged us to doubt everything. I also explained that faith means doubt in the existence of God, because faith means certainty of my own beliefs, not certainty of God. No certainty, it doesn't prove anything that God exists. It's just whether I believe in it. Just an aside, just a quick aside. But anyway, for us to be truly free from superstition, we had to doubt feudal society, the monarchy, the church, our irrational historical past. Rationality was and would be the measure of, as I said before, the measure of everything. Okay, but where does the terror come from? And how do we get from absolute freedom and pure rationality to chop people's heads off without trial? Okay, many of those who supported the terror initially believed that the death penalty itself was a manifestation of superstition. So Robespierre was one of those idealists. And why did these revolutionaries change their view? Why did they become terrorists? So first, let's do a brief historical outline of the events that led to the terror and just a conventional description of the terror. So the revolution takes place in 1789. The aim is to turn King Louis into a constitutional monarch. Louis XVI, however, didn't want to play ball. He didn't want to share power with the elected National Assembly, and he tried to run away in 1791 in June to organise a counter-revolution. So Austria and Prussia also went to war with France in the spring of 1792. That put the French revolutionary government under extreme pressure. Louis was found guilty of treason, and he was banged to rights, by the way, guilty, and he was guillotined in January 21st, 1793. This extraordinary crisis of war, invasion, treason by the monarch, forced the convention into drastic action. Drastic action, though, isn't yet terror. But Hegel sees a logic of terror already present in French society. So on the 10th of June, La Loi de la Grande Terreur was passed, the law of the Great Terror. And by the end of the Great Terror, by July 1794, there were 16,000 official executions and 10,000 executions without trial. In 1794, February, Robespierre explained why the terror was a necessary form of exceptional justice in the context of a revolutionary government. And we discover that the terror for Robespierre wasn't just a response to the invading armies and the crisis. It's about changing human nature. So, this is what he says. If the basis of popular government in peacetime is virtue, the basis of popular government during a revolution is both virtue and terror. Virtue without which terror is baneful, terror without which virtue is powerless. Terror is nothing more than speedy, severe, and inflexible justice. It is thus an emanation of virtue. It is less a principle in itself than a consequence of the general principle of democracy applied to the most pressing needs of the patrie. Patrie is the homeland. So the word virtue that Robespierre is obsessed with and uses a lot, and he acted like a virtuous man. That's a direct reference to the French Enlightenment thinker Montesquieu, who wrote 50 years before the revolution. So Montesquieu was among the most influential thinkers of the French Enlightenment. So he criticized the excesses of absolutism. And Montesquieu's spirit of the laws, that defines a major principle of democratic government as virtue, which according to Montesquieu, virtue is the love of laws and of our country. So terror, according to Robespierre, therefore, is just an emanation or a product of virtue. Robespierre thought that it was imperative to implant virtue into the French people themselves and to root out those who didn't have this quality. So a search for virtue logically entails a search for what was not virtuous. To purge a virtuous society of the non-virtuous was therefore one of the imperatives and one of the drives towards terror. The reign of terror accelerated the rejection of hierarchy and the corrupt, intolerant influence of religion. So between the 20th of June and the 27th of June, however, 85% of the victims of the terror belonged to the Third Estate. Only 8% were members of the nobility. So it wasn't men in wigs who actually were the main victims of the terror. The engine of terror was the pursuit, as I said, of perfection, a society free from irrationality, from vice, from tradition. The law of the Great Terror meant that you could be executed for slandering patriotism, seeking to inspire discouragement, whatever that is, spreading false news and depraving morals. So citizens had to actively denounce those suspected. No witnesses, no defense counsel for the accused were allowed. There were only two possible verdicts, acquittal or death. Accusation was basically a death sentence. There were no longer political factions. Instead, there was just one Rousseauian general will. Rousseau, that's his word, the phrase, the general will. I mean, unfair to Rousseau saying that it was all Rousseau's fault or is that one of his ideas. But anyway, that's the general will, interpreted by the revolutionaries. And of course, there's no question of elections. Committees of surveillance were set up and they were responsible for arresting suspects, okay? And they issued certificat de civisme, identity papers that proved your patriotism. So think for 1 minute, how do you prove your patriotism or your allegiance to the revolution? Okay, you denounce others. Denunciation, by the way, was an obligation upon citizens, and it was an expression of the public good, and that's how you do it. So the terror went way beyond defensive measures to combat a series of crises. It became a project to transform French society into the Republic of Virtue, and of course the Republic of Reason. So the hell of terror was the road along which the French Revolution would reach the heaven of reason. Although we think of Hegel as being the ultimate abstract thinker, don't we? He thinks that abstraction causes the terror. In fact, it's the opposite. Let's take Robespierre's abstract ideal of virtue that we just mentioned then. Virtue can mean all kinds of things to different people. But the real world is complex and abstract ideas only capture part of what the world's about. So if you're totally committed to an abstract ideal, virtue, the revolution, Marxism, the party, whatever it is, when you project that onto society, if you mistake this abstraction or part of the truth for the whole, your abstract conception encounters really messy reality along the way, and very quickly. Affirming your abstraction, impressing it onto the world, means making the thoughts and actions of others conform to yours. You get resistance from those people who don't share your abstraction. And that results in revolutionary violence, not against real living people. You'll find it's never you've done something wrong individually. It's violence against abstract enemies of the revolution. They always are abstractions. The enemy of the people is an abstraction. Ultimately, Hegel's argument goes the revolution cannot realize its own conception of the world. The failure of absolute freedom leads to a reconsideration of the idea of freedom by spirit. This is hopefully the end of the story, or higher meaning of freedom. Okay, we're supposed to learn a lesson, I think he's saying from the Terror. But unfortunately, these forms of consciousness, these abstractions, never disappear. And we live in an era when the rule of abstractions is on the march once more. We are still nowhere near that historical self-understanding that Hegel perhaps thought that we would reach now. The logic of the French Revolution has been the logic of, I think, every subsequent progressive overthrow of social relations. I briefly mentioned Cambodia and Pol Pot, but let's look at the biggie revolution, the Russian Revolution of October 1917. And we don't need to dig into the works of right-wing authors like Orlando Figes or whoever you think of. No one like that to discover the downside of the revolution. So I'm not going to quote any right-wing authors. We just need to look at the words of the revolutionaries themselves. So a few examples. This is not to say that, by the way, this isn't to say that Lenin planned a campaign of terror. He clearly didn't. Before October, nothing could be further from his mind than the introduction of a political police system. Mind you, nothing was further from Robespierre's mind than the guillotine. But Lenin was naively and wildly optimistic, you could say. In fact, he was against the standing army and he was against a regular police force completely. In creating a secret police and a repressive state apparatus, it seems he was simply reacting to obstacles along the path of the revolution. He improvised. He was following the logic of revolution. When I say revolution, the logic of events, I should say. In fact, Lenin himself deviated from the Marxist base in so many ways. I mean, introducing the NEP, war communism, it was just a whole series of deviations, one after the other. That's for another video series, however. However, within weeks of the revolution, he created the secret police, and it became a vital tool of the revolution. And I think, actually, you can probably trace it to the 7th of December. There was a bank and public officials strike, and they seem to be the trigger point for the consolidation of this new apparatus. And the selection of Felix Dzerzhinsky as the leader of the secret police seemed a completely natural thing to do. Lenin remarked, "We must find a staunch proletarian Jacobin, and surely we shall not fail to find our own Fouquier Tinville, who will be able to tame the encroaching counter-revolution." This is in December, remind you, a few weeks after the revolution. So Fouquier Tinville, by the way, was the lawyer. He was the lawyer of the French Revolution. He's the one who did the death certificates and wanted justice, revolutionary justice. And again, Lenin was invoking the French example. He said that the Bolsheviks were Jacobins. I'm just Robespierre in the 20th century. Perhaps in response to Hegel, I think it's important to note that in revolutions, time passes very, very quickly. Crisis follows upon crisis. You haven't solved the first crisis, and another one comes along. So the actors in the crisis, they feel that they are influencing events because they are making fast and critical decisions. So the party passes, let's have war communism. No, let's not have that. They make another decision. Everything is a quick decision. There's no time to think, actually. There's no time to philosophize or react. And in a sense, though, that does kind of prove Hegel's point. It's not necessarily the subjective decisions of the players that count. It's this Hegelian notion of spirit. It isn't the kind of conscious individual weighing up the concrete political circumstances. Events tend to control the actors and not vice versa. And it's only much later, with the slow passage of philosophical time, that we get to understand the meaning of the social actors who were acting in the swirling social chaos of revolution. So there are two time frames, therefore, at war. There's the slow time frame of philosophy, and there's the split-second stopwatch time frame of political necessity. So you think you're building the revolution, but in fact you're strangling it. Every step towards the creation of a new model human, it takes me in the wrong direction. Example, early in June 1918, Felix Dzerzhinsky and one of his left social revolutionary deputies gave a joint press interview. So subtlety wasn't one of Iron Felix's strong points, but honesty was. This is what he says. The public and the press misunderstand the character and tasks of our commission. We stand for organised terror. Thank God it's not unorganised. So this should be frankly stated. Terror being absolutely indispensable in current revolutionary conditions. We terrorise the enemies of the Soviet government in order to stifle crime at its inception. So you don't prosecute someone for someone that they've done. You do it from birth before they get a chance. Okay. So the commission consists of 8 tested revolutionaries, virtuous people. Execution is only admissible by unanimous decision of the commission members in a plenary session. So, of course, even we can make mistakes. But so far, there have been no mistakes, as is proved by our records of proceedings. Yeah. In almost every case, the criminals, driven into a corner by the evidence, admit their guilt. And what argument can have greater weight than the personal confession of the accused? Okay, so confession without trial and in detention is proof of guilt for the Soviet secret police from the very start. As I said, within weeks, this was the case. So there was clearly, though, a difference between the Stalinist terror and Lenin's regime. But the examples of terror at the earlier stages of the revolution are impossible to dismiss. I want to quote from Lenin himself. This is a classic, this one. In How to Organize Competition. I mean, who reads that today? It's just, you think it's going to be boring. In fact, it's not boring at all. December 1917, this is weeks into the revolution. This is what he says. This is the start of the revolution. A pledge of success in achieving the single common aim to clean the land of Russia of all vermin, of fleas, of the rogues, of bugs, the rich, not just the rich, and so on and so forth. And so on and so forth. So you're ridding the land of bugs and vermin. And this is what happens. In one place, half a score of rich, a dozen rogues, half a dozen workers who shirk their work will be put in prison. That's bad, isn't it? Goes further. In another place, they will be put to cleaning latrines. In a third place, they will be provided with yellow tickets after they have served their time, so that everyone shall keep an eye on them. If you don't work hard, you'll have a badge so people can look at you for public mockery. I haven't finished yet. As harmful persons until they reform. Finally, in a fourth place, 1 out of every 10 idlers will be shot on the spot. Idlers. Shoot a lazy worker on the spot. So, there's lots of people, I would say the majority of people on the left, have, myself included, have been through that school of Marxist-Leninism. Okay. And have been in organisations, have read the theory, have read Lenin. But most of those people today, probably, they work in unions. In some cases, don't work in unions. Some of them work in unions, by the way. Yeah, a lot of them do. Yeah, in the, what's it called? The Red Freemasonry, which gets you jobs there. Right? No, some are very good. Some are most on merit, but there is that, you're my mate. Okay, but there's another, but lots on the lay structure. Loads of people like myself on the lay structure. Loads of people are from like Marxist organisations, and they have to defend workers every week. Idlers, lazy workers, inverted commas. So people have been off quite a bit. So you can imagine any Marxist reading that and then going in to an HR meeting, like a human resource meeting, a worker who's been, they're representing like that. Imagine they were representing someone from, it could be any left organisation you think of, and they read that, right, I'm going to follow Lenin's teachings on this, it's absolutely correct like that, and they go in to 1917, they represent the worker, December 1917, at an HR meeting, a back to work meeting, someone's been off for 2 weeks, so the union rep comes in and goes, right, the boss comes in, okay, sit down, yeah, sit down, you okay, yeah, well, first of all, there's a number of options on the table. Or what would that be? Is it like a support plan, or would it be like monitor my time? No. It's no support plan. What we're going to do is we're going to cut your food ration initially. Then we're going to put a star on you to say that I am a lazy person. And then, what? Wait a minute. This is to get me back to work. Yeah. It's to encourage you to get back to work so people don't see that you're an idler. And then finally, it might be you, but it might not. But we're going to kill 1 in 10 people who are lazy. Oh, does that seem? Yeah, that seems fair. Yeah. So anyway, that would be a real conversation. Seriously, I'm not joking. So if you see someone like myself who's been through that school, just quote Lenin on competition and say, "Is that the way you defend someone in a worker state?" Anyway, revolution, it is a strange mix of cold logic and purifying fire. Part 2 of the terror, next time we'll go into more philosophical stuff. Okay, I might do it from here. I'll see how my throat goes. It's just very windy today. Okay, so adios.